Good morning, church. My name is Madison Wyman. I serve as a pastoral intern under Pastor Daniel and Pastor Matt. I hope this video this morning finds you well, and if it doesn't, I hope that you can bring that to the Lord this morning and know that even in a time such as this, that God is able to and desires to bring fulfillment, peace, and joy into your life. Let's start this morning with the reading of Colossians 1:15 through 20 as a call to worship. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross.
The love of Christ is rich and free, fixed on his own eternally. No word nor hell can it remove, long as he lives his own here love. His loving heart engaged to be their everlasting surety. 'Twas love that took their cause at hand, and love maintains it to the end. Love cannot from its post withdraw, nor death, nor hell, nor sin, nor law can turn the surety's heart away. He'll love his own till endless day. Love has redeemed his sheep with blood, and love will bring them safe to God. Love calls them all from death to life, and love will finish all their strife. Love cannot from its post withdraw, nor death, nor hell, nor sin, nor law can turn the surety's heart away. He'll love his own till endless day. Love goes through every changing scene. No rod can him from Zion wean. Not all the wanderings of her heart can make his love for her depart. Love cannot from its post withdraw, nor death, nor hell, nor sin, nor law can turn the surety's heart away. He'll love his own till endless day. And death beyond the grave he'll love, in endless bliss his own shall prove. The blazing glory of that love, which never could from them remove, which never could from them remove.
Well, good morning once again, Terra Nova family. We're going to be, as expected, back in Matthew's Gospel today, continuing on in chapter 8. but I feel like it would be a little bit like avoiding the elephant in the room, not to mention something in light of what we've recently heard from our government at the state and the federal level. So let me just speak to that briefly. Though I'm not going to have a lot of specifics for you, I do want to acknowledge that. This past Wednesday, I believe it was, as many of you know, we heard from our governor that there was an allowance made for religious groups of 10 or less following social distancing guidelines to be able to gather together for worship. And so, number one, I just want to say I'm grateful for that. That's a sign that things are moving in the right direction, that in the near future we see opportunity for us to gather again. And actually, that's pretty imminent for us. As you guys who've been a part of Terra long enough know, and especially if you're in a tribe, many of our tribes are already set up. Those are our small groups at Terra Nova Church, so that they're meeting 3-4 times a month, and a couple of those occasions are broken down into just men or just women for the increased accountability and intimacy and fellowship that can be had in those contexts. And so that already fits. That model we were doing, at least that portion of it fits what the governor is saying is being allowed now for religious organizations. And so that's something that we're already in communication with our tribe leaders about, and figuring out how do we at least create that space for us to begin regathering, and maybe even think of ways in which we could extend that to those who aren't in tribes, even at that scale of 10 or less at this point in time. So know we're thinking about that. Know that we're also aware and really grateful for our president having stood up for the church, having our backs, saying that it's important and essential that the church be able to gather. That's super encouraging for us. We're still waiting for the dust to settle on that and really just see what does that mean for us. This whole process, one of the things that we felt really important is for us to not be hasty in our decisions, and to stay this course of being patient in faith as we submit to our governing authorities in these extraordinary times, while at the same time feeling the weight and the pressure and the gravity and the desire of wanting to be able to gather together. Our president's words hopefully can only have a positive and beneficial effect in moving that ball forward that much more quickly to where we can be gathering as an entire church together. So we'll at least this week have more information out to you on what that's going to look like for us in groups of 10 or less, which is something that we can start doing immediately. And we hope to begin regathering together in larger groups sometime very soon. All right, so today we're going to be continuing on in Matthew chapter 8, verses 18 to 22. I had alluded to this last week when we finished up this incredible journey of following Jesus through these 3 instances of healing and interaction with these outcasts within society, and seeing the great power and love and compassion of Jesus on display, all these things that rightfully we are attracted to Jesus because of, we have an affinity to him for, an awe and a reverence to him because of. And I also alluded to the fact that it's really important that we heard that well and that we steeped in that, because what he was going to have to say next was going to be hard for some of us, if not all of us, to hear. This is one of those passages on the cost of discipleship that when you hear it and you don't just whiz past what Jesus is saying, it leaves a pit in your stomach. It makes you uncomfortable. It's unnerving. It's confusing, perhaps, even. Maybe it's a little bit like the feeling that Peter had when he had just finished declaring Jesus to be the Christ, the Son of the living God. But then Jesus told him and the others what he would have to do, go to the cross. And Peter said, never am I going to, that's not going to happen. May that never be. And then Jesus tells Peter, get behind me, Satan. That's another one of those passages where if you're in Peter's shoes, and even as we read it, we're like, what? Wait, Jesus can't say that. He wouldn't say that, would he? And they're hard passages, but they're necessary and good, because when we press into them, we're pressing into the mystery and the wonder and the awe and the hugeness of God's holiness and character. This is another one of those passages when it comes to considering what it means to count the cost as Jesus' disciples. Let's read together then Matthew chapter 8, verses 18 to 22, and unpack it together this morning. All right. give you a second to open your Bibles if they're not already, or open your Bible apps. Matthew 8:18. Now, when Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to go to the other side. But before that happened, a scribe comes up to Jesus, and he says to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." And another disciple said to him, "Lord, let me go first and bury my father." And Jesus said to him, "Follow me, and leave the dead to bury their own dead." The first thing that struck me, and maybe it has never really struck me before like it did this time when I was reading this passage, is the following truth about Jesus. Jesus withdraws from people. That's not something that we think or talk about much, right? The idea of Jesus moving away, withdrawing from people. We think of, the prodigal father whose arms are wide open, just awaiting and almost beckoning the prodigal son to come home. We think of the parable of the lost sheep whom the father goes after. And we think of all these different, rightly, attributes of God that are his yearning and longing and desire for his lost people to come to him, going after people, right? But here we see an instance of Jesus withdrawing from people. And so we have to pause. We have to actually allow the things that are counterintuitive sometimes when it comes to who we understand God and Jesus to be to sink in, pause, and think about those things. The implications, why those things might be. So, why might that be? Well, I think that, first of all, we have to consider here the context, the people in view. It isn't just that Jesus arbitrarily chose to withdraw from this particular group of people, and they were no different than any other. What we find out about these people, in light of the context that follows, is that they may not have had the best motivations in being near Jesus to begin with. All right, so if that sounds strange to you, this idea of Jesus withdrawing from certain groups of people, just know it's not unprecedented in the Word. We have other passages of Scripture where we see this same response of Jesus to particular crowds. So in John chapter 6, verse 15, this is where he has just miraculously fed this crowd of 5,000 people, multiplying just a few fishes and loaves. At the end of this passage, the people are so hyped up with and marveling over the amazingness of Jesus that they do something that is out of line with who Jesus is and what his will is at that point in time. And so we read in verse 15 at the end of that story, this is speaking of Jesus, perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, Jesus withdrew to the mountain by himself. All right, see, the right thing in this instance was actually for Jesus to withdraw from those people because they were drawn to him for the wrong reasons. They were drawn to him because they saw in Jesus a version of Jesus that would suit their own purposes, which is not what Jesus had come for. So the right thing was for him to withdraw. We also see this kind of idea of Jesus discerning the motivations of people following him not to be quite on par with what they need to be in places like John chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. This follows some scenes of Jesus performing healings and miracles that people are rightfully amazed by. And we're told this about Jesus. But Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people, and he needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. Jesus knows our hearts, and he knows our motivations. So the bottom line that I want you to hear at this point is this. Sometimes Jesus withdraws from those who are following him for the wrong reasons, for the wrong motivations. But the question, once again, is why? Well, at best, if he's to allow for those following him for the wrong reasons to continue to do so, it's going to be fruitless to entertain these crowds. At worst, it's going to result and lead to a misleading presentation of what discipleship is really all about. Because here's what discipleship is not, guys. Let me just give you some examples of false versions of discipleship that you and I probably have even fallen into the trap of thinking before. First of all, discipleship is not seeing Jesus as a good crutch, right? That we lean heavily upon him in times of need until we feel like we can handle matters again. And then we take that crutch, Jesus, and we put him into the dark closet, nowhere to be seen in our daily life or even in our, just forgotten there collecting dust. I think rather than a crutch, following Jesus as a disciple should be and is much more like breathing air. A lot of the times we don't even realize we need it, but we're doing it. We desperately need air every moment of every day. That's what discipleship is like, not treating Jesus like a crutch. Another way in which we can have a false view of discipleship is by thinking, Jesus is okay by me so long as it doesn't mean you fill in the blank as to where you've drawn or would draw the line as to I'm willing to go to this point, but not any further. Another way to put it is kind of having one foot in the realm of following after Jesus and one foot in the realm of my own hopes, desires, and this world. That is not what discipleship is, nor does Jesus want to mislead us into thinking that that is the case. Another false version of discipleship may be those who would say, hey, I'm willing to follow Jesus so long as he continues to perform, so long as he continues to do these amazing, miraculous things, either because it's just entertaining for me or because I want to be a part of his entourage because he's so cool, right? We wouldn't talk about it in terms so simple like that, but some people will be willing to follow Jesus purely by virtue of wanting to be associated with the guy who is amazing, that everybody's marveling over, right? That's something that would be true for Jesus in his time, probably characteristic of some of what was going on in our passage here today. It may be because of a standard of living that Jesus is providing for us. And all of a sudden that gets taken away. And we say to ourselves, well, if that's gone, then what reason do I have to follow him anymore? I thought following Jesus meant my standard of living would always be this. These are versions of what, and examples of what discipleship is not. And if Jesus condoned these things, then he would be misleading us. So he doesn't. Guys, I want you to hear something that may feel counterintuitive as we read difficult passages like this. But Jesus loves us and people so much that he pulls no punches because he doesn't want to lead people astray. And we saw another example of this in our previous passage that I didn't get a chance to touch on last week. But in Matthew chapter 8, verses 11 and 12, at the end of Jesus' interaction with the centurion there, where he marvels at his faith, and he says that it surpasses even that of anything he's seen in Israel amongst his own people, the Jewish people. He then says this in verses 11 and 12. He says, I tell you, many will come from east and west to recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. And of course, he has in mind Gentiles, non-Jews at this point, like the centurion. But he goes on to say in verse 12, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness, in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. All right, this is another one of those passages that's really hard and difficult to enter into and to really want to embrace, given other things that we know and believe and want to embrace about Jesus. But what's going on here? Well, Jesus is trying to teach us about what true faith looks like, both in that passage where you had these guys like the leper and the centurion who were recognizing Jesus as Lord and humbly coming before him to do what they could never do. That's a part of what faith looks like. Today, we're looking at how part of what faith looks like is, are we willing not only to worship Jesus as Lord, but also count the cost and follow after him, even when it comes at our own expense? And here's what I want you to see when Jesus gives this warning last week on hell. This is what he's talking about here, hell. That there will be some who think that they are abiding in true faith and actually aren't. And so he gives that warning that some of those people under that delusion will actually be cast into outer darkness. F.D. Bruner, a commentator and scholar, says something provocatively at this point I want to share with you. He says, hell is not a doctrine used to frighten unbelievers. It's a doctrine used to warn those who think themselves believers. It is no small thing to make light of what true faith actually is Because if we do, and to make light of what true discipleship actually looks like, because if we do, Jesus is saying, these could be the consequences. And he does not want to leave any of us questioning whether or not he was clear on what it means to follow after him. So before Jesus then gets into the boat, he's discerning, all right, this crowd is, some people are here for the right reasons, some and many not the right reasons. So he's about to get into this boat to withdraw, to go to the other side of the lake. Before he does, it becomes very clear and evident what's in some of the hearts of the people here, as he has a couple of would-be disciples come to him and ask him if they can follow him. And so Jesus sets the record very straight here as to what it means to follow him. And he has this encounter with this first would-be disciple, this scribe, whom we'll talk about in just a moment in greater detail. And the big takeaway, I'm just going to tell you it up front, from this encounter could be boiled down to this. True disciples must make a break with dependence upon earthly safety and security. True disciples must make a break with dependence upon earthly safety and security. So you've got this scribe here. Some of what gives away that his motivations might have been slightly askew here is the fact, first of all, that he addresses Jesus as teacher. Well, that's what the scribe was too. He was basically addressing Jesus as a peer at this point, because the scribes in Israel were primarily those who were teachers of the law. Here's where this becomes important. Remember last week when we were looking at especially the leper and the centurion, how did they address Jesus? Do you remember? They addressed him as Lord. And the reason why that is important is not so much because of what it meant generically in the culture at the time, but because of what we know those men must have meant by it, by virtue of two things. Number one, by Matthew's time, years later, when he writes this gospel, that term, Lord, kurios in the Greek, regularly came to refer to Christ's deity. It came to mean much more than the generic title and term that was used to address people in society. Because that's the thing, the term Lord could have been just used simply as a polite address to somebody who was a superior to them socially. Here's how we know that's not the case. When you look at the context for the leper and the centurion and how they were addressing Jesus as Lord here, the expectation for what Jesus could do on their part, the faith that they revealed, also reveals that the significance to that address was much more than just a polite expression of or deference to one's superior social status. And then, of course, we know that couldn't even have been true for the centurion, because the Romans saw themselves as socially superior to the people that they had subjugated anyway. So clearly, there was something conveyed about the faith, the sincere faith, and hearts to follow Jesus on the parts of those we looked at last week that isn't being expressed here by the scribe as he addresses Jesus as teacher. Now, when he says this, he's also acknowledging Jesus's vocation and livelihood as being one and the same as his own. So perhaps what was going on for this scribe is that he saw Jesus having a greater degree of success than he was. And so he figures, well, I'm going to tag along with him, right? He's drawing larger crowds than I am. He's likely to be more prosperous in this endeavor than I am. So, hey, if you can't beat him, join him, kind of a thing, right? And essentially the question that Jesus is trying to leave him with and us here is this. Was that motivation the kind of motivation that really is going to be willing to count the cost? So understand here that in Jesus' response to the scribe, part of what allows us to understand he knew the scribe didn't fully understand who he was talking to or what he was saying is the fact that Jesus says in response and refers to himself as the Son of Man, right? The Son of Man doesn't have, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Well, that's so critically important. And here's why. In the New Testament, that term is used like 90 or more times, all but 3 of which I believe by Jesus, in reference to himself. But its origin comes from the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, where in chapter 7 we're introduced to this figure, the Son of Man, whom we're shown coming before God and being given by God the divine right to rule his kingdom. And so this term came to be understood later, but even should have been understood then by this scribe that Jesus was making a messianic claim. So think about it. If Jesus was saying, I am the Messiah, I am divine, and this is what my life is like. Think about what he's saying. You have God himself here who is willing to humble himself, come off of his throne into creation, and humble himself to a point more low than the creatures that he had made. Think of Philippians 2, 5-8, the humility of Jesus there, lowering himself by becoming one of us and ultimately dying for us. If that is his precedent and example for us, then what do you think the expectation is going to be for his disciples? So you got the animals themselves who have no home, or who have homes, and Jesus is saying, I am lowering myself below those I've created. And so therefore, if Jesus is willing to give up infinitely more than we ever even could, how much more should we expect the cost of discipleship to resemble his? This is what Jesus is trying to get this scribe to see here. Now, practically, that isn't going to literally look like for all of us, being called to leave our home, to become homeless. That's important to understand, right? I want to bring you back to a moment for the principle and then actually talk about how that may apply in light of our homes and the purpose they serve in our lives. Literally here, or I should say figuratively, the principle here again has to do with our earthly safety and security. And true discipleship is a willingness to follow Jesus that exceeds, that goes beyond our desire and need for earthly safety and security. That's the big principle here. But when you apply this specifically to the idea of our homes, having a home, let's just think about that for a moment. I think the idea is this. God is calling us here as his disciples. If he's given us homes, if our careers and vocations have not required us to be essentially nomads and traveling wanderers like Jesus, to use those homes for God's purposes primarily and not our own. A few different ways in which that may play itself out. Things you may have even been faced with before. Certainly, I know I have. Let me just ask you these in the form of questions. Are you okay, for example, with your home being messed up by your kids? Or messed up by guests who you invite over? Or messed up by your guests' kids who come over? Are you okay with that? It's not your home anyway. You've been called to lay that right down as a result of being a disciple of Christ. Are you okay with offering a place to someone to stay who is in need of a home, a place of refuge, who doesn't have one of their own? Even if that means you're living cramped. Even if that means at face value, on the surface, you see no way in which that can work in the context of your 2-3 bedroom home. I think counting the cost following Jesus, if we've been given a home to steward, may look like that. Are you okay with maybe, you're later in life and you're an empty nester and you've got more home than you need, using some of that extra space to house those in need, or maybe even downsizing and taking the proceeds from that and giving it to someone that God has made you aware of is in great financial need. I'm just trying to give you examples here to see of what it might look like to count the cost and to be willing to accept that cost of following Jesus if you do own a home, which Jesus did not. Then, of course, there are missionaries who are more literally examples of, in many cases, what Jesus himself is saying here, who don't have a true home, who are more of the pure nomad and wanderers and relying upon God through the provision of his saints all around the world who are housing missionaries as they travel. So those are just some practical examples to think through. So there's your first would-be disciple who comes to Jesus, whom he's trying to help identify, hey, I'm not really sure you understand what it means to count the cost of following me. Are you really, truly willing to do so in this sense, giving up your earthly safety and security? Then you've got this second disciple that comes to Jesus. And let me give you kind of the headline that would have shown up in the newspaper the next day from people overhearing this dialogue. What Jesus, in essence, is saying to this second disciple is, true disciples must make a break with any earthly loyalty that's above loyalty to Christ. So you got this guy who comes forward. He says to Jesus, let me first go and bury my father. And Jesus says in response to him, follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead. Let me just say at the outset here, this is one of the more difficult verses in Scripture to swallow. this is borderline harsh, or at least it feels and seems that way to us. Jesus is essentially it seems like calling this guy to not value the life or the death of his father as much as following after him. So what do we make of that? Well, we've got to kind of unpack a little bit more about what might be going on here to understand the motive that Jesus was trying to get to. Jesus doesn't think families are unimportant. In fact, quite the contrary, because they're so important, it's easy to put them on a pedestal of the one thing perhaps that could be the exception to delaying a discipleship life of following after Jesus. So here's what's going on here. First of all, when Jesus says, let the dead bury their own dead, he's not talking about, the Walking Dead or zombies going around burying other dead people, okay? Probably that's pretty evident and clear. The New Living Translation, another translation of Scripture, which is more thought for thought, kind of drawing out the thoughts, puts it this way: let the spiritually dead bury their own dead, okay? In other words, if Jesus is saying, if you're going to follow me, your loyalties will need to reflect those of those who've been raised by grace to new spiritual life. By grace, by no doing of their own, they've been given new spiritual life. Therefore, you will have new priorities if you are a true disciple. So here's what's going on in this scene. We don't know, and it's left open to us as to whether or not this man's father has actually already died or not. It could be that he died that day, in which case the funeral would have been that day, and there would have been a week of grieving through various rituals that the Jewish people did. It could also have been that this man was kind of implying, my father is he's in old age, he's in failing health, I feel indebted to care for him, and so therefore, let me see my father's dying days out, then I will come and follow you, Jesus. In either case, whether his father had just died and he was just going to observe the memorials and the grieving, or whether his father was still alive, but kind of the end was in sight and the man felt kind of this obligation and duty to remain with his father, whether it was out of love or something more cynical, some scholars have said, of kind of waiting around for the inheritance. Either way, in either case, what the man was saying in so many words is this: let me take care of these things first, and then I will follow after you. And Jesus is calling out a dangerous tendency in many would-be followers of his, and it's this: there's always one more thing that we could do or we could take care of before we start following Jesus with all of our hearts. All right, let me give you some examples of this. I'm not above this. Some of these examples come from things I know have gone on in my own heart. Even as a true disciple of Jesus, I've experienced the temptation to do these kinds of things before. For example, we can say to ourselves, man, I just need to fulfill this one last goal of mine. This one last thing I want to accomplish that I just feel like won't be possible if I fully devote myself to following Jesus. Then I'll be satisfied. Then I can follow you, Jesus. I think sometimes we can fall into the trap of just sinning that one last time. And then I'll be done with that forever, and I'll fully commit to following after Jesus. Listen, we don't often call it sin. I think in those instances, we may say, this probably isn't the best thing for me, but it's not the worst thing in the world. And man, it brings all kinds of satisfaction in these ways in my life. And I don't think that he would really mind. Just this one last time, then I'll follow after Jesus. Or maybe it's that we're just needing to get through this difficult season we're in, and I'm not sure yet what it looks like to lean on Jesus to get me through this difficult season. So I'm just going to get through this hard time. Then I'll turn to you and see what it means to trust you and follow you, Jesus. There are all kinds of reasons, all kinds of excuses that we can come up with that seem justified in our minds as to that one last thing to take care of or to do before we start following Jesus with all of our hearts. So let me ask you guys the question that's probably self-evident from these examples today. What is the one thing that you keep telling yourself that in your mind justifies a delay in following Jesus with all of your heart? All right, is it an earthly loyalty to a family member? Is it a certain, probably what needs to be called a sin in your life that you love? Is it a dream that you're unwilling to let go of? Listen, Jesus isn't against family. Jesus isn't even against your dreams necessarily. He's against the false impression that people have that they can have a greater allegiance to anything else and still be a true disciple. All right, and I think that this is one of the reasons why it's so helpful that Jesus gives this example of the Father, because what greater excuse, what greater basis or reason could we imagine for somebody to say a delay is justified and leaving it all and following after Jesus than being around to care for our beloved parents or someone who has died and grieving over that loss? So if that could even be a false motivation, a disorder of loyalty in our hearts, how much more all those other things that we stake a claim in as being important enough to delay following after Jesus. Last thing I really want to say here, guys, as we move toward a close, it's going to be a temptation as you read passages like this to chalk it up to hyperbole. And we can't do that because there's nothing that Jesus is saying here that gives us the warrant to do so. All right, and if we do so, if we just think, this is hyperbolic to kind of slightly move us on, along the sliding scale towards a more serious walk with him, then all we're going to end up doing is justifying a play it safe Christianity. We'll end up just justifying a path of least resistance because we would say to ourselves, Jesus wouldn't have us suffer like this. I mean, there's got to be a line somewhere, right? He wouldn't have us suffer like this. He wouldn't include this in what it means to count the cost, would he? Yeah, I think sometimes yes. Jesus says in John 16:33, as he's teaching his disciples there towards the end of his earthly life, preparing them for life beyond, Jesus being physically with them in the world, he says, I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, he says. You will have trial. You will suffer. You will face persecution. All kinds of trials are in view here. But then he goes on and he says, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. Now, see this. This is where zooming back and looking at our broader context, both what came before last week, but also what's coming next week is important. Because where discipleship leads us into suffering, Jesus is with us. I think that that's what he's showing next week when we get into what happens next. Right after these encounters with these two men in the crowds, Jesus gets into the boat, they go out onto the lake, and there's this huge raging storm that comes along. And the disciples are afraid for their lives. They really believe that they're about ready to be capsized and drown. But by virtue of them sticking with Jesus, by virtue of them not saying, you know what, that's too high of a cost, we're going to stay with you, Jesus. What they experienced, even amidst that tribulation, was Jesus with them, and they got to experience the revelation of God in witnessing Jesus' power in unprecedented ways that they had not experienced before. And they also got to experience a deeper level of worship and awe of Jesus because they stuck with him. They were counting the cost, as imperfectly as that may have been the case, and they experienced that in the midst of their tribulation. So the reason why, guys, I think it's so easiest for you to be reluctant in taking Jesus's difficult words like this seriously and wanting to just chalk it up to hyperbole is because it seems too extreme. We probably are saying to ourselves on a subconscious level, on what basis could he truly demand this from us? And it's because we forget. It's because we forget that the one who gave up everything to give us everything now has the right to demand from us our all, our everything. The one who gave up everything, the Son of Man who left his throne in heaven, who became a man to the point of suffering and death on the cross, who became a man and was of a lowlier status in his comfort, security, and safety than his earthly creatures he had made. Yeah, he gave up everything for us so that he could give us everything. What we saw last week symbolized, I think, in his having healed Peter's probably terminally sick mother-in-law and giving her life, symbolizing not just the physical life that Jesus can restore and the healing he can bring and all of those things that he can do here and now in this life, but ultimately the spiritual life that he has secured for us by his blood on the cross once and for all. He gives us everything. And now, therefore, he is in a position to require from us everything. If we don't believe the first two pieces of that, if we don't believe that he's the one who gave up everything to give us everything, or if we forget those things, then we're probably going to not believe, or we will take lightly that last piece, that he could really be serious when calling us to this kind of a cost of discipleship. Listen, guys, Jesus isn't interested in half-hearted disciples. And that doesn't mean that he doesn't love those who have the wrong motivations who come to him, but it does mean, at least in some cases, that he withdraws his presence from those who are hanging around him for the wrong reasons. So listen, if you and I really want to experience transformation in our lives, if we really want to experience a depth of intimacy and the presence of Jesus in our life in a strong way, then we have to be willing to go to the places where Jesus has already gone and is calling us. And frankly, I know that that's what you want, Tara. And so let's press into that hard together, okay? And remember, there's no cost that you may have to pay that he is not worthy of in your life, because he has already paid a cost that's far greater by virtue of the life and the love that he has secured for you and restored to you on the cross.
So sure and steady, my hope is held in your hand. When castles crumble and breath is bleeding, upon this rock I will stand. Upon this rock I will stand. Glory, we have no other King but Jesus, Lord of all. Praise the anthem, how loud his praises ring, we crown him Lord of all. Shattered and broken, the curse of sin's tyranny. My life is hidden beneath heaven's shadow. Your crimson flood covers me. Your crimson flood covers me. Glory, glory, we have no other King than Jesus, Lord of all. Praise the anthem, how loud his praises ring, we crown him Lord of all. my sorrows, Jesus is better. Make my heart believe. In all my victories, Jesus is better. Make my heart believe. Than any comfort, Jesus is better. Make my heart believe. More than all riches, Jesus is better. Make my heart believe. Our souls declaring Jesus is better. Make my heart believe. Our song eternal, Jesus is better. Make my heart believe. Glory, glory, we have no other King but Jesus, Lord of all. Praise the anthem, our loudest praises ring. We crown him Lord of all. We crown him Lord of all.
Church, as a way of benediction this morning, I'd like to leave us with Ephesians chapter 3, verses 14 through 19. For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named, that according to the riches of his glory he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Amen.